sudden, it is just 12 months to an election. A Prime Minister who has run a government that has tried to make a virtue of steady and middle-of-the-road change faces a perfect storm of changes yet to be done, not much time to do it, and a slowing economy. While journalists still talk about budget night, a sort of one night of the year for political and economic junkies, the reality is that these days there is more of a budget season. Governments have increasingly taken to running a long campaign of budget drops, abandoning the pretense of budget leaks for a couple of weeks before budget day. This year, though, has not just seen the shovelling out of individual spending announcements. The messages about what the budget is about have come thick and fast.
This budget is about cost of living.
This government is seeing the greatest investment in housing that we have seen for a very long period of time.
You'll see in the budget the focus on a future made in Australia.
It'll be a budget for mums and middle Australia, a budget for families and pensioners and students and young people.
The announcements of all of these ideas have often been notably short on detail.
One of the things, I guess, that the government's going to really have to work on tomorrow night is what is the narrative out of this budget. They're trying to hit a lot of different pots and really getting a clear idea of what that clear narrative is for the economy over the next 12 months is a little bit difficult to decipher.
The economy has been changing. The messaging is more difficult, something the Treasurer seemed acutely aware of when we caught up with him in Sydney early last month.
It's definitely true that the balance of risk in the economy has shifted a bit over the last few months. Growth is flat, consumption has been flat, even though we've got real wages growing and unemployment rate lower and all of these sorts of things. And so this one will probably be a little bit harder to land because it's a more of a nuanced set of economic conditions.
And things have only become more complicated since then.
Our concerns are focused primarily on commodity prices and revenue, Chinese property sector and growth, Eastern Europe, and I said, and supply chains, and the Middle East and oil prices. Because of this international uncertainty, the budget will downgrade forecasts for growth in most of the biggest economies that the Treasury provides a forecast for.
Laura, can I show you the days to budget?
Absolutely.
I have to say we've tidied it up a little bit. It had other things on it, but we've just left the numbers there for you.
Is there a ceremonial crosser outer? Is that your job?
No, it's not my. No. The staff are much better with numbers than what I am, so they do the crossing out.
Well, that's reassuring. Dr. Stephen Kennedy is the Secretary of the Treasury. Last week, he and his team were in the final stages of budget preparation, bringing together the decisions of Cabinet's Expenditure Review Committee, or ERC.
We would have had over 20 ERCs since January. The government will have made hundreds of decisions. On the night, people are very focused on the new decisions, but a big thing about governing is the fact that you have to make a lot of decisions just to keep governing, and budgets are about that as well.
So how to reconcile the changing economic pressures and all the demands for spending? The toughest question facing the government concerns inflation. The immense cost of living pressures facing households have been an obvious economic and political problem for the government for much of the past 12 months. But in the past couple of days, it has become clear there is now an even sharper question of economic and political credibility for Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese. That's because we go into tomorrow night's budget knowing that, in a highly unusual turn of events, the inflation forecasts of the Reserve Bank and the Federal Treasury are quite different.
The forecasts that the government has put out today, and as you say, unusually a day before budget, indicate a quicker drop in inflation than what the RBA forecasts showed recently. What the Treasury is now expecting is that inflation will fall into the RBA's target band of 2 to 3% by the end of this year, which is slightly faster than what the Reserve Bank was anticipating.
The government says the difference stems from the fact that the Reserve Bank's forecasts are being made without knowing what is in the budget. But there are two really obvious risks. The first is that the RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, emerges next month and says the budget doesn't change the bank's view, meaning rates would be unlikely to fall until late next year. That's embarrassing in the short term, but also means rates would not fall until after the federal election. The second risk is that the vagaries of monthly statistics means that the government's forecast that inflation will be significantly lower at the end of this year is not met.
We're talking 0.1, 0.2% across a couple of measures, but certainly it seems that Treasury seems to think there is more of a downside risk than the RBA is factoring in. In terms of which one's right, it's quite possible neither is right.
The government has been warned for months by economists that there are risks that its budget decisions could actually add to inflation, including its decision to go ahead with the so-called Stage 3 tax cuts, even if they were redesigned in January to give bigger cuts to lower income earners at the expense of the higher paid.
In terms of the sort of overall impact on the economy, they remain relatively inflationary. They're about $20 billion extra a year that's going to be flowing through the economy that isn't right now.
The inflation outlook is also not the only thing to have changed. The budget will contain a lower growth forecast and will predict a higher unemployment rate.
So the economy's slowed down. Growth is sluggish. At a per capita or per person level, the economy isn't growing.
A crucial decision in the budget, both in terms of the politics and economics, is the one to slash the migration intake in half. The bounce back in migration after the pandemic was a major driver of economic growth, but it has turned from major boon to major headache amid a shortage of housing that is now regularly described as a crisis.
The reason that the economy's continued to grow and the reason that employment has stayed up is because of migration. So an intention to pull back on migration will, all other things being equal, slow down the rate of economic growth?
Look, it's going to have a big economic impact, and I think this is really the economic cost of having a housing market that can't meet the demand for housing. We do have a severe housing shortage at the moment, and so adding people to that is only going to make it worse. And so we are going to have a limit on that economic growth as a result of that.
Dr Angela Jackson is also a member of the government's Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, which advises the government on the equity issues that it needs to consider. There are two things she would like to see in the budget tomorrow night on the equity agenda.
I think one is job seeker. I think we really have allowed the payment to deteriorate to a point where it is so far below the poverty line that it's doing more harm than good. Providing universal access to every child in this country to 3 days, regardless of whether their parents are working or not, is an investment, I think, for the future that we should be making on equity grounds, but also future economic growth grounds.
There are certain forms of spending that still make social and economic sense. The government signalled that it intends to support the early childhood education sector in its fight in the Fair Work Commission for a wage rise, and that's the example of a sort of spending measure that ultimately makes economic sense because it's a sector that's facing real shortages.
The Grattan Institute is also calling for a rise in rental assistance. Beyond all the questions about economic forecasts and spending and taxing decisions, there is still the political task of selling a credible story to voters.
I think the role of political leaders, and in this case particularly the Treasurer, there is an important story to be told about this country, its economy, and the role of these budgets in setting us up for the future.
In a surprising move, the government has released its inflation forecast ahead of the budget. It says inflation could be back in the so-called target range by Christmas. That would mean an inflation figure of 3%. It's highly significant because it suggests a possible interest rate cut could follow, and it's also lower than the Reserve Bank forecast last week. So what gives? Economist Chris Richardson joins me now. Chris, welcome. So first of all, how unusual is it for them to do that? And then after that, what do you make of this particular forecast?
It's unusual and it's important. It basically says to Australians, not only do you get a tax cut in the next 6 weeks, you get an interest rate cut in the next 6 months, and you get all that plus the extra spending that the government is hinting that is coming and that state governments have announced in recent days as well. That combination would be an economically and politically happy one for the government.
But right now, what we're looking at is a situation where the government has come out with this surprising forecast, as I just said, different to the forecast from the Reserve Bank only last week. How can those figures be so divergent?
And it's quite a lot of difference, and they're only a week apart. And that week was a week in which a bunch of state governments announced a lot of extra spending, and we'll hear extra spending from the government, the federal government, tomorrow night. Ordinarily, you would expect that the extra spending, if anything, was going to make inflation higher. It may be that Treasury is more worried about the everything else spending, for example, by families being weaker than the Reserve Bank thinks. That could square the circle, or in other words, it may be, careful what you wish for. You might get lower inflation because the pain being felt by families in particular is worse than the Reserve Bank expects.
Let's just stay with what it actually means. If they've got it right, and of course we won't know that for some time, but of course what the people in the audience want to know is, if that forecast is correct, does that mean a bigger chance of getting a cut in the interest rate sooner than expected?
Absolutely. Everything now comes down to how fast the continuing fall in inflation is and when that says you can get an interest rate cut. The market today bet its own money in judgment on the government's new forecast. It didn't shift things too much. The market still thinks it's more likely that the next move from the Reserve Bank is up than down, but that the most likely thing of all is that rates don't change for a long time, including not before the election.
But let's just help the audience understand better why there's a discrepancy between the two. Is this a more political forecast than the Reserve Bank's forecast from last week, or is there a really significant data difference between the two?
So both will have been professionally done. There won't have been political interference in either set of forecasts, but it's a big difference. And it's a difference, again, that comes despite the fact that the handful of days between the two forecasts saw governments open their purses and spend a bunch more money. That, to me, says really only one thing can square the circle, that the pain out there in the private sector is greater than the Reserve Bank thinks, or at least that's the Treasury view.
And just before that, is it the case that the money that was announced by the Queensland government for electricity, the WA money in their budget, and Victoria, is all of that included in the government arriving at its forecast? It
should have been. I mean, it's known, and it's big bucks. We are talking about those three alone is an extra $9 billion of government impetus to the economy inside the next 12 months.
Now, in the period leading up to tomorrow's budget, what we've been hearing from you and from economists across the country is the government needs to be very careful with this budget. They mustn't do anything to make it an inflationary budget. Does this forecast change the way we think about what's announced tomorrow?
Oh, well, it certainly does. I mean, if Treasury is right, if inflation is falling faster than the Reserve Bank said, then it gives room, right? It means that the extra spending from the feds themselves and the states is a good thing, is helping to protect the economy and yet allowing enough room for inflation to come down. Or in other words, the Reserve Bank has tried to be on this narrow path, juggling inflation versus the pain in the economy. This is, to some extent, the government wrenching the wheel away from the Reserve Bank and saying, hang on, things look worse than you, the Reserve Bank, thought. We're going to spend a bit more, and we think this is a safer path to be on.
Have we learned something about Australian saving habits? Because one of the big questions also around the money that's going to be announced tomorrow in terms of cost of living relief is we always think, we understand Australians spend that money, they don't save it. Do the new numbers, the numbers of pain being suffered in the economy, in household spending, does that suggest people are saving more than we're used to?
So as of the last numbers we had, which date a couple of months ago, the average Australian was spending 97 cents in every dollar that they get. That would need to change pretty substantially, and clearly some people, particularly older and richer Australians, will save some of their electricity rebate money. They will save some of their tax cut. Chances are, though, that a fair amount of this money would be spent, and I think that's why markets are still suggesting that perhaps the Reserve Bank view on inflation is a bit more likely than the Treasury view.
So what do you do if you're a consumer sitting at home weighing up what to do, how to change their spending habits, their saving habits? Should they bank this forecast? Should they rely on it or not?
Well, you've got two very reputable organisations saying two quite different things about inflation. The good news is the common ground, inflation will continue to fall, but just how fast it falls, Treasury is a bit more brave perhaps in its forecast than some others.
Brave is always an interesting word in politics, but just briefly on the question of how we understand this budget, there's been a lot of debate around whether or not cost of living relief is inflationary. Has Treasury come up with a magic formula that somehow this form of stimulus spending is not inflationary?
No, it hasn't. If these subsidies could magically not merely help people with the cost of living, but also help around inflation, why not double or triple them or make them 10 times as big? There is no magic wand. Cost of living relief tends to also be inflationary. That's why governments here and around the world do little things and pretend they're big things.
All right, little things, big things. We'll see what happens tomorrow, Chris. Look forward to your expertise again tomorrow. Thank you.